Probably one of the most visible changes, quite frankly, is the explosion, the mushrooming, the growth in the number of people in need of urgent assistance. The global humanitarian overview, that's a joint appeal coordinated by the United Nations together with partners, the Food and Agriculture Organization is part of it, launched at the end of last year an appeal to support some 230 million people. I mean, these numbers, quite frankly, are eye-watering, and it tells us that we need to do not just more, but we need to do it better.
People.
Fundamentally, it's about putting resources in the hands of affected farming families. This means, for example, seeds, tools, technical assistance to allow them to plant for a coming season. It means keeping animals alive during a drought period or during a winter, and we do that through provision of emergency animal feed, even medical assistance, veterinary assistance to animals to keep these precious assets alive. Often it's also about just putting cash in the hands of people. I mean, if you or I are affected by a disaster, you know, we know best how to respond to our immediate needs. So I was just in Afghanistan just over a month ago. And Afghanistan is by necessity one of FAO's largest emergency and resilience programs. And just last year alone, to give you a sense of the scale, FAO, with some 21 implementing partners, directly supported more than 6 million Afghans. 6 million rural Afghans with time-sensitive interventions. And these were many of the types of activities that I just mentioned. So we've been keeping animals alive through the winter season. I took part in, witnessed a distribution of emergency animal feed to female-headed households in Afghanistan, right? Very practical activities that keep these precious assets alive through the winter. We provide cash support to female-headed households, marginalized families that even don't have access to a lot of land. So we have a huge example recently that FAO was pivotal in successfully leading in support of a number of governments, which was responding to and preventing this major desert locust outbreak that hit much of the Horn of Africa, Eastern Africa, and indeed beyond. And there the interventions were vital, because rather than waiting for these swarms of locusts that can be literally tens of kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide that are eating everything in their paths, early detection, treatment, allowed us to respond at scale. And just to put this in financial terms, this was a response over 2 years that cost $230 million. It saved at least $1.8 billion in crop losses. It makes sense. Why wait until the disaster happens before you respond?
I saw you speak to Gada.
Unfortunately, what we're seeing in the Horn of Africa is an example of early warning analysis and anticipatory action calls going really unheeded. FAO and other partners in the UN system back in late 2021 were calling for a scaled up response, because we saw that rains were failing, and indeed that communities and vulnerable households were under stress. So even back then we were saying there needs to be a scaled up response. We had the tragic experiences of 2017-18 and earlier drought events as well, hard-won experiences there that told us that we needed to work differently. Again, Somalia is a really good example of where a time-sensitive agricultural intervention would enable a family to have to be able to stay on their land, to not be forced to displace to a camp outside of an urban setting. Our experience in Somalia and elsewhere tells us that if people's animals are still alive, if they have crops in the ground, if they've been able to plant seeds, if there are things to tend, more often than not, they will not be forced to flee elsewhere.
It's not dry.
Inside Tigray, in a context where there was conflict unfolding, there was armed conflict taking place, people were still able to grow. And with FAO support and other partners, at the same time as some 200,000 metric tons of international assistance by other agencies was trucked in, and there were concerns about physical access to communities, during that same period of time, farmers in Tigray, with support from FAO and others, produced 900,000 metric tons of food. So equivalent to 6 to 7 months of the food requirements of that region of the world. So again, you know, the lesson in these spaces is people have a lot more resilience, a lot more ability to cope, perhaps, than some of the international narrative gives them credit for. And we're also able, with these time-sensitive interventions, to allow people to provide for themselves, even in the most challenging circumstances. So you have a majority of the population relying on farming and a minority of the funding to support agricultural response activities. And this just simply doesn't make sense. We have year-on-year humanitarian responses. We also, as FAO, respond after what we call sudden onset events, after, for example, the tragedy that we've seen now of the earthquake in Turkey that's impacting both Turkey and Syria. This is also part of what we do, and it needs a time-sensitive response.